Hello, I'm Pastor Larry Enriquez, and I'm here with you in the start of this 2023 Christmas season, the Advent season as we see it or say it, the first Advent, the first coming of Jesus, the first appearing of Christ in the flesh. And I can't help but be reminded of why he came and how I think it is vital for us to teach that and to demonstrate that as we have grandkids and children, that we don't get caught up so much in the commercialism of our day. I know it seems almost impossible, but it's not. I want to encourage you to choose to uplift the Advent and the wonder and the beauty and the humility of Christ's coming and why he came, that he came to set us free, and ultimately he came to forgive us by cleansing us of all of our sins, by taking a debt that we owe upon himself and paying that debt. So I use these terms on purpose, of course, because it's kind of the theme. As you look around, we're filming here, and you can see just a little bit of some Christmassy things. And again, it just reminds us of Christmas being a time of celebrating the greatest gift ever, which was the gift of Jesus who came to save. And he saves us through forgiveness. So let's look at this passage. We'll look at a couple if we can at this time, and kind of glean from these passages that the Lord gives us regarding forgiveness, because forgiveness isn't just something in the sky, something that's kind of separated from us, but dreamy, and it sounds good and makes us feel good if we're the ones being forgiven. And forgiveness isn't just something that's in the heavenlies that happens to us one day when we go to heaven. But forgiveness is an everyday occurrence. It's a moment-by-moment reality, if I can say it that way, but the fact that we're forgiven already by Jesus once and for all forever. And by that I mean it's an everyday realization of the fact that we are forgiven, even though we practically do things that we need to confess and work through. So that's part of that whole scenario of forgiveness, and the fact that people wrong us and we're always forgiving. So I say that forgiveness in that regard is messy. There aren't clean lines everywhere. I push this one button, I totally forget, you're wrong against me. So when it talks about love, for instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about love, and he says love isn't this and it's that. And he says ultimately, too, it's not one who keeps wrongs. You don't keep a list of offenses that somebody has done to you. And that's not talking about people out in the world, because out there in the world, people may sin against us and then we go on, but we don't deal much with them coming in the future, but the people we're close to, our husbands and our wives and our children, our playmates, our neighbors, our church brothers and sisters, these are ongoing relationships. They're long-term relationships, and so it gets messy that way, because the record of wrong is easy to bring up when you're married, and so we have to work at not keeping a record of wrong, of not bringing it back up. So forgiveness is an ongoing work that is messy. Our need not to hold grudges. Our need to treat others with kindness and favor. Our need to rely upon the reality of our own forgiveness to be empowered to forgive others. Well, let's look at some scriptures that helps us, again, bring these things into real practice. Is the parable of the unmerciful servant. And by the way, how love is connected to forgiveness. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times. We went over this last week. This is a number that Jesus replies with that is ongoing to infinity. I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants." As soon as I read that, I remember thinking, Jesus came to settle accounts. That's what he came to do. He settled our accounts. He came down to settle our accounts. What does that mean? Our debt, what we owe. I gave you that metaphor last week regarding the debt collector who bought the paper of the promises we made but couldn't keep. And so now he's collecting our debt. And Jesus, in essence, came to collect our debt. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts. He wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man owed him 10,000 talents, and he was brought before him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me. Now let's just look at this story that Jesus gives briefly. He gives the story to tell us, one, that this debt is great. How much is 10,000 talents? Well, in our system, it'd be about $10 million. About 10 million bucks. And in that regard, what he owes is more than he can really pay. His debt is great, however you want to say it. His debt is tremendous. Can you imagine? I mean, sometimes we are just oppressed with, $1,000, a few $1,000s. Maybe some of you owe 100,000. I don't know, but 10 million. So, again, in kind of this way of teaching, Jesus is given this big number to get the sense of it. It's a way of speaking to help us gain the gravity of the principle that's being spoken here. The servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me. You need to think, be patient. You owe me 10 million. You're saying be patient. It's kind of like odd. It's like, does that even make sense? Be patient with me. I owe 10 million. It's coming soon. I'm buying lottery tickets by the thousands. And he says, be patient with me, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, was merciful towards him, and he canceled the debt and let him go. So this picture, this story, this metaphorical story, this pretend story that the Lord has given us is full of truth. That's why he gives it. That's why he tells it. And we find that the servant is one who has been visited with mercy, with pity. But it doesn't tell us really about the servant's response per se, which is really important here in light of understanding our own position with God. The story goes on, Jesus says, but when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, maybe $2,000. So here's what Jesus is juxtaposing. Here's a guy who's been forgiven a debt of 10 million, and he has someone who owes him 2,000. He grabbed him, began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, much like he was fallen at the knees of his master, begging to give him time to repay the 10 million. The story is just being mirrored here. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. It's easy to see the iniquity here and to see the imbalance here. They were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. So we're now getting a sense of the heart of the one who has been forgiven. Now here's the deal. It's like Jesus came to forgive the sins of the world. But only the sins of those who receive him are forgiven. He came to forgive the sins of the world, but only some are forgiven. Because I think that the reflection of this person's heart is a reflection, in a way, of those who never receive Christ, who never understand the gift or receive it with gratitude. So it's never appointed to them or to their account. So they remain in debt. Because it says, then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be, here's what Jesus says, to be tortured until he should pay back what he owed. It's like, because I have forgiven you all your debt and you didn't receive it as such. In other words, that your heart was not transformed by that. Isn't that kind of what he's saying? That because your heart wasn't given over to the reality of what's happened to you, that there really is no change. So ultimately, he has come to transform us, to make us new people, to make us more like the master. And it didn't take. The servant's heart is revealed in his not being like the master. I would want to kind of throw this out there. I'd want to say that, if you know Jesus, if you really know him, then you really know what forgiveness means to you, and you begin to reflect that in your life. And by the nature of being someone who's been forgiven, you will be kinder. You will be more merciful. You will be more forgiving, period. You will practice not holding debts against people who don't treat you the way you want to be treated. And some are going to be harder than others because there's levels of transgressions. It's messy, but you will be different because you've been forgiven. Jesus goes on to say, "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." Those are tough words he's saying there. There's this connection here to the fact that real forgiveness in your life is going to be met out in real practice in your life. It didn't stay in the heavenlies. It stays right here. It moves right here. It goes like this and it goes like this. And if this isn't happening, then something's wrong with this. And then we have to go beware. Forgiveness is messy. Forgiveness is an ongoing process. But it needs to come to the believer as being transformative, that we become more like the Master. There's a passage in Luke chapter 7. I would say verse 36. So before I read it out of the NIV here, let me just say that an ultra religious person has invited Jesus over, which that was a pretty good thing in itself. Not sure what all his motives were, but he invited him over, and he's ultra religious. He's a Pharisee. They keep popping in and out of the narrative in the Gospels, and we find that their religiosity has kept them from God, really. Because you can have religion without relationship, and that's just what they were. But there were some honest seekers there. But here and there, Jesus goes to his house, who's a man of the law, and in this setting, a woman kind of interrupts by not her screaming and yelling and crying to Jesus, but by her actions. So let me read it to you. Now, one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, so he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in this town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. Now you can guess at what her profession was, and her sin, and her deep guilt and pain, and I can only imagine that throughout life and throughout the world there are people involved in sinful activities because they see it as their only way out. It's something that maybe they even despise, or something that's killing to them, but they do it to try to save themselves for the moments. But nonetheless, she meets Christ in the house with an expensive jar of ointment and perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. It's a lot of crying. And it again reflects the depth of the reality that she's confronted with in her own life. That what she's doing has just been a terrible existence by which it has whittled away at her sense of worth and value as a human being. I can only imagine that in the gravity of her weeping. Now, maybe you have felt that way before. Maybe not. But there's some sense of this that I think is and should be a part of all of us. When we recognize the gravity of our own sin. We all, I suppose, sin at different level. I don't know what that is. I just know that my sin keeps me out of heaven, and only through the forgiveness of Jesus do I get to heaven. Do you see the gravity of your sin? There's nothing worse than pride and religiosity to help people see themselves as being over others. And that's the opposite of who Jesus was and what he taught. So she's crying, weeping at his feet. There's this scent of ceremony that's going through the house. It's her big money item that has created this environment. As she weeps at his feet, then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Again, if you can kind of just bear with me here a little bit. We have Jesus, the King of Kings, God in the flesh, who has dirty feet, because they traveled in sandals, in the dirt, mostly. Oh, they had cobblestone streets, and if anybody was going to have a street, it'd be somewhere that the Romans had provided. But it was dirty. And then we have, again, this woman who's crying at his feet, at the really foot, at that humble place. Anytime you'd humble yourselves, it would be at the feet of someone. It is recognizing the distance between, my sin and your superiority, or my brokenness and your wholeness. And there was always that reality in being at someone's feet. It was a metaphor and it was real. When the Pharisee had seen this, he makes this comment. Again, he's a religious person. If he knew of her for ill repute ways, he wouldn't let her touch him. Jesus knows this, knows his heart, and he answers him, Simon, I have something to tell you. This isn't Simon Peter, this is Simon, a different Pharisee. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 men owed money to a certain money lender. 2 men owed money. They had a debt. 2 men had a debt. One's debt was 500 denarii, and the other was 50. So this is a huge imbalance there. One owes a ton, and one not so much. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debt, or the debts of both. And here's what Jesus says. That the level of your ability to understand your forgiveness and how much you've been forgiven will be corresponding to your response of love. That the response to forgiveness is love. That's what I think he's saying here, partly. He goes on to say, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. Now let's just go back a little bit. When Jesus says to him, who's going to be more gracious? Who's going to love more? The one who's forgiven a lot or a little? And he responds, I suppose, I'm going back down to verse 43, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled, I suppose. I mean, he's being coy here. It's kind of doesn't want to quite, I suppose. The one who has been, who has had the bigger debt canceled. And Jesus says, you said it right. The one who's been forgiven more. So in one sense, he's trapping the Pharisee, if that's the right word, in order for the Pharisee to see the reality of the correlation between forgiveness and love. Debt paid and love. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who has been forgiven little loves little. When you are loved by God and you recognize the gravity of the forgiveness that has been poured over your head, then it becomes personal. It is transformative forever. And you love God because he has first loved you. And your response is love. You know, when you practice forgiveness to others in your life, You can be a transforming agent for them too. Love is powerful. The love of Christ to you, and that being reflected in your way with others. May you know forgiveness in this Christmas season and why Jesus came. To settle accounts for the Father and offer forgiveness and payment of debt for all of those who owed it. May you know the power and the wonder and the beauty of that this Advent season. God bless you. God love you. I love you. I hope to see you this Sunday at church. Go in peace.